equality. White skies.
It's just that human connection for me.
That's absolutely key.
What is an ally and why is it important in the workplace? What makes a good ally and what does allyship look like in practice? Can allies be superheroes? Welcome to Wide Skies. I'm Martin York.
And I'm Debbie Watt. On this episode, we're delighted to be joined by Beth McManus. Beth McManus is a creative northerner who works as a coach, psychologist, researcher, and illustrator. Her values of authenticity, creativity, curiosity, empathy, and kindness inform her work, which has a particular focus on human connection, well-being, and emotions. And Mark Overend. Mark is an experienced service desk manager for a global IT service organisation. He has a keen interest in corporate social responsibility and has led a number of significant and highly successful workplace initiatives to give back to communities. So I'd like to start off by asking, what makes a good ally in your view?
I think that's such a good question, and it's something I've been really reflecting on. It's quite difficult to answer in some respects because I think it can look quite different in different contexts. But really where I've landed is that being a good ally is quite similar to being a good coach. It involves quite a lot of the same behaviours, the same skills. So there's definitely a piece about listening. This is, it can be an active space, but it's fundamentally about the people who you are, I guess, in service of as an ally and their experience and what's going on for them. It's not really about you as the ally in that moment, if that makes sense. So there's a real need for listening, for curiosity, to be genuinely interested in learning about someone else's life, their perspective, their context, their experience, and therefore being able to have the empathy to put yourself in their shoes and to understand why certain things might need you to step in and kind of advocate and be an ally on their behalf. There's another episode I know around kindness and compassion, and for me it's a very compassionate container that you want to create as an ally for the person or people or communities that you're working with and supporting. When I think of instances where I've felt I was inhabiting that ally space or persona, or however you want to contextualize that, it's usually where I felt quite irritated or annoyed, or there was a sense of injustice. But actually it's important to stay in that calm space, again, removing the fact that it's not about you, and therefore being angry and being that's great as a driver, but actually you have the privilege of being one step removed from the situation in a way that actually allows you to be calm and logical and reasonable and rational in that moment and really be supportive in that way. So that's some of my some of my thoughts, I think.
I think that's a really good point, actually.
For me, having probably playing the part of being an ally, but then also having allies. I worked on a number of CSR projects during first sort of stint with Fujitsu, but then having those team members who I could always rely on for support. Some people will come to work, they want to come to work, do their work and go home and just focus on what they're doing day to day. But then there are different sets of people who are more interested in the sort of wider scope of what's going on around. And the people that I then associated as my allies were the ones who were always up for getting involved in different things, different projects. And I think I was probably an ally of Martin, because he knew if he was promoting something or wanted, straight away, I would jump in and be active. So I'd like to think of myself as an ally, but one good at spotting and recruiting those allies as part of my team as well.
Martin, do you want to add in here as well?
It was interesting how Mark said allyship can work both ways, and I think that's a really key concept. I loved some of the words that Beth used, so I wrote down genuine interest and the curiosity and compassionate, and this is all very much about the people involved. It's very much a personal thing. I think the other aspects that are really important to me, and I guess it builds on what's been said already, but having an open mind. So suspending all judgment that you've got, and maybe being prepared to learn new things, new and unfamiliar things, and sometimes to unlearn things that we thought to be true, because part of allyship is really putting yourself in a situation that you might not have encountered personally, something that's very unfamiliar. To a certain extent, there's also an element of being prepared to feel uncomfortable sometimes and embrace the uncomfortable, because
Yes.
I think when you're in uncomfortable and unfamiliar waters, it probably means that you're learning something new.
Being uncomfortable and recognizing it's okay to make mistakes. You just need to talk to each other and find out people's views. What I'm hearing is that this idea of allyship is very important to all of you personally.
I have always had a very strong sense of fairness and justice, and anything that calls that into question for me is, you know, something that I instantly feel very strongly about.
That's not right.
And I also think and I think to Martin's point there about that human connection, it's for me, it's part of being human, is to support others, to build community, to connect with other people. I guess what I'm talking to here, allyship isn't only when there's an injustice or when someone says something and you've got to step in. You know, it's much broader than that. But I think that's where it can feel the most challenging space to be in, is if you have to directly challenge something or really support someone through something very difficult. It's just that human connection for me, that fundamental part of life. So yeah, it does feel really important, but it also just feels really obvious to me that this is how you would be in the world, right?
Yeah.
I thought it was really interesting when you were saying about not only when there's an injustice, because
Yes.
I think that feels to me broadly similar to, we talk frequently about Pride and Pride Month in the UK, and there's a classic example. If you get all the companies that jump on the bandwagon and it's all glitter and unicorns for a week or a month, and then for the rest of the year they do nothing. And so there's the stark difference between those that get it and do it 24/7, 365, and those that just do it as a marketing opportunity. And I think at a personal level that there's a correlation there with allyship isn't there just for the extreme times, the bad times. It should be there all the time.
It isn't just for Christmas.
Yeah.
But I think some people do find it challenging. They do find it difficult. And sometimes it's just easier to put your head down. But when it's a bit more important, potentially, what do you think holds people back from being an active ally?
A lot of it comes down to people's confidence, really. I had people who were absolutely active and always, you know, willing to throw their hat into the ring, whereas other people just didn't want to. And you know, I would always try and investigate, is it a case of you don't want to be involved or you're nervous about being involved? Because if it's the latter which is putting you off, then obviously we can talk about that and we can try and work around that. I think you've got to kind of live and breathe it as well. And you know, the point Martin made, a great one about playing lip service, that's absolutely key. And you know, the same, you know, with the Pride Week, you know, the mental health awareness week or month, and you know, we'll do all this stuff, and then once it's gone, we'll just go back to normal. And that's not how it should be. What you're doing in that week should be the seen as normal, rather than we just go back and we'll forget about it for another year. So I think, you know, living and breathing those things, I think, are absolutely core. The core values which Beth mentioned, fairness and justice, absolutely. You know, some of mine are equality, diversity, inclusion. You know, if I'm managing a team, I want everybody to feel equal. I want everybody to feel included, and supporting different networks and making everybody aware of what's available and everybody feeling included. I think, you know, that's part of who I am, and I feel that's very, very important.
It's interesting hearing you, Mark and Beth, both talking about what drives you personally about allyship and being an ally. And it's just, I get this fire in my belly, you know, that if I see somebody being wrong done by it really annoys me. And you know, I have this calm exterior, but I really have a sense of injustice to other people. And it really annoys me when, if you can make space for somebody whose voice isn't being heard, why wouldn't you? It just doesn't make sense to me that you would want to somehow suppress somebody else's voices. There's always room at the table for another person. It feels like common sense.
It does feel like common sense, but I don't think it's common sense to everyone. No. And I think, like you say, some people, you've got that fire in your belly and you're feeling it. There'll be people out there who they can feel that's wrong, but they don't know what to do about it. So they've got that fire, but it's kind of, I don't know what to do. I don't know what to do to make it right. You guys are very much talking about how to be an active ally. How do you think people can be passive allies? You know, is there such a thing?
I guess I'm on the fence about that, and I see allyship as being something that you need to do rather than just say.
Yeah.
I do have a concern that sometimes, particularly in the workplace, that with the best of intents, what you end up with is initiatives where somebody will wear a rainbow lanyard and change their email signature, and that's the extent to which they do things. And the thing is, that doesn't change hearts and minds, and
No.
it doesn't necessarily raise the right awareness. So if I think back to my previous life, when Mark and I used to work together in Fujitsu, one of the things that I did was a rainbow lanyard campaign as part of the LGBT plus network. But the reason why I did it and the way that it worked was that it was designed to encourage a conversation. And so if somebody wanted to request one, they could have one, but they had one with a leaflet that explained what the purpose of it was, and to explain why the network existed, and to enable them to have a conversation with somebody else who would say, that's a nice lanyard, why are you wearing it?
Yes.
And so it wasn't just a fashion accessory, and I think that's really important, because if you don't do things, you don't change anything.
I heard when you were talking, Mark, you were very much talking about you would question people to find out why they were having difficulties. And it's that having that confidence to do that questioning, I think, is very important. I don't think everyone feels they've got the permission to do that sometimes.
That's true. And the teams which I've managed over the years have always been actively involved in CSR activities and some of the sort of employee networks. And it's something I've always tried to encourage, probably more so than, other teams I've worked alongside, but always tried to get those people to sort of buy into them. And many of them have. And we've run lots and lots of different sort of activities from Wakefield, engaged with sort of Prince's Trust, with Wakefield Works, doing mock interviews with schools and careers days and colleges, and working with mental health charities and stuff. And always looking at different ways then of also trying to sort of recruit people. And, I always go back to my interview at Fujitsu, and I didn't really have any experience within the sort of IT sector, but I was given a chance. And that always stuck with me, as somebody gave me an opportunity and a chance. And that's something I always try and give opportunities to people who might not find that opportunity the standard way. So, if we can go to an open day in a library and get talking to somebody who would never have applied for a job on the internet at Fujitsu, but we can talk them into coming and having a chat and recruiting people that way. And it's a very, very different way, which is, something I'm really sort of passionate about.
That's a lovely example of how you put allyship into action.
I just want to go back slightly to the passive active conundrum. I think you can be a passive ally on your journey towards being an active ally. I agree with what Martin's saying, that it's not enough to remain in that passive space. But I think what you were talking to, Debbie, and Mark, around people being given permission, I think also there's a lot of really difficult language barriers in terms of what's the right terminology, how do I say something that isn't going to offend people, and talking to different people from the same community will have vastly different opinions on what language is okay and isn't okay. So it does feel a bit like a minefield sometimes. There's a couple of pieces that are coming up really strongly for me. So there's a really brilliant article on Medium by a guy called Willy Jackson, and I think it's called something like "Don't be an ally, be an accomplice." And it's a really fantastic kind of article that's really talking about that active allyship, but it also talks in there about how this is not a zero-sum game. Like, if you're moving into that accomplice status of really being advocates and actively being in that space, you may stand to lose things. And so you've got to be prepared and willing to step into that space of loss and fear. We talk about needing confidence and courage. So it's almost, you've got to accept the opposite side of that as a potential consequence. And also on the language piece, it's reminding me, there's some great work by Rosemary Campbell-Stephens, and she talks about how the use of kind of BAME, or even worse when people say BAME, and ethnic minorities, she uses the language around global majority heritage, and actually that people that have been kind of racially put into these groups make up 80% of the world's population, and therefore we need to reference that in the way we talk about them. So once you kind of start looking out there and reading these people's opinion pieces and research, you feel emboldened and empowered to step into the space. But I think for lots of people, I think a bit of permission of remaining in that more passive space whilst they're building education, whilst they're talking to people, being curious, building the knowledge is okay. But I see it as a a trajectory, it's almost in service of getting to that active end.
It's got to be part of the journey, yes.
I'd certainly agree with that. It's interesting that you mentioned about the acronym BAME. I've done some training previously with a theatre, and there's a big drive in the arts, in the performing arts. It's a movement called BAME Over, and it's to stop people using that terminology for exactly the reasons that you said. And so they talk about diaspora and people who have been subjected to racism, and those are much better terms if you're trying to explain exactly who it is that you're trying to reach, or if you're trying to target individual communities, then name them as the communities that they are, rather than just putting them together in this group for the convenience of the white majority in the UK and Western countries. And I think it's interesting that you say about that journey, Beth, because certainly I think one of the challenges is people lack the confidence to say the right thing, and therefore we get stuck in the analysis paralysis of we don't want to say the wrong thing, and so we don't say anything at all, so we get stuck. And you're spot on when you say that people need to have that space to be able to grow and to learn and to feel confident and fully equipped to be able to then take the action that they need. I guess my clumsy point to begin with is it's no good just staying on the start of the journey, and it's important that you need to think about the journey end that you're trying to get to. But you're right that there are steps in between there.
And to value those steps as well. So, I need to make those steps. It's no point, like you say, just wearing the lanyard and putting a sort of picture around your faces. I agree with you. You recognise this is important. Let's make those steps.
There's a previous question that I'd like to put some more response around, which was, why is being an ally important to you personally? I think if you're in a minority group or an underrepresented group, and you think about in the workplace in particular, that sometimes you need others to be able to speak up for you and support you, because you can't necessarily do it on your own. If you're one person in a group of 100 people, you need allies around you to be able to help you in what it is that you're trying to achieve. And I think the other thing on a personal level for me is that I learn a lot from people who are different from me, and I really enjoy that richness of difference because it makes my life more interesting. So that's one of the benefits to me of being an ally. I really value that. And I think fundamentally as well, that being an ally demonstrates that somebody cares and values another person, and that can only be a good thing. And it tends to be a two-way thing as well, because if you feel like you're valued by somebody else, that makes you and them feel good. So of course that has a benefit on both of your well-being as well.
Martin, I would say, was an ally of mine, which I sometimes called for help and assistance. I think of one particular instance where one of my team members had been going through a lot of problems, suffering with lots of depression, and we had long conversations and sort of trying to understand the sort of root causes of this. And then eventually it came out, and he told me he was suffering gender dysphoria, and had done for many years, and having a real sort of confusion about his own identity, and didn't know what to do, and wanted to be somebody else, but was obviously incredibly scared of having that first conversation. I had the conversation with his permission, with Martin, and we provided significant amount of support to this person, and the support between ourselves and through Martin, it changed this person's life, from being at the point of wanting to not be here to feeling that they were a person again, and they could move towards who they really wanted to be, and just that knowing who to reach out to as a people manager to make sure that we provided as much support and care to this person was crucial.
It's strange to hear you recount that from my perspective, Mark, because I very much saw you as being an ally in that. Because I was the chair of the LGBT plus network at the time, then I felt like I had the responsibility of being able to help employees that might find themselves in significant life change situations. And the important thing for me was that you recognised as a manager that there were routes available for them and for you to be able to get support, and that we could work together on that. So I think we were very much allies for each other. Which is what it's all about for me. Is
it worth just exploring this idea of the employee resource group a little bit more?
If I start with the purpose and the setup of employee networks, generally they tend to fall to protected characteristics. So you might have a disability network, you might have an LGBT plus network, you might have a gender network. Importantly, for a gender network, it should consider people of all genders, not just women, which is where organisations may tend to start. And there are a whole variety of other different networks. Ethnicity comes up, of course, as well, and parents and carers. And the whole purpose of them really is to give a voice to people in groups whose voices may not be heard, or they may feel that they're not formally represented. And it's really important in each of those groups that they don't become exclusive just for the people that are in the subject of focus. They have some way of being able to engage allies, and it might be some organisations choose to have a separate allies network specifically. Other organisations invite allies to participate in each of the individual network. And it was the latter that we chose to do at Fujitsu because we wanted all the networks to be open. You have to think about sensitivities, confidentialities, and in the early stages, the fact that people may not have disclosed particular characteristics in the workplace. And so at that point, that may not be your entry point for the allies. That they might come at a later stage. But allies are really invaluable in that situation. And I guess I'd be interested, Mark, from your perspective as to what you gained out of it generally as a manager, having those networks around you, not just necessarily the one that I ran.
I felt it was a great resource to be able to not refer people into, but having a diverse team of people from all backgrounds, sort of all different ages, and just making sure that there was something there for everybody to feel included and supported. And making sure that I had the information and I had the contacts that if they needed to engage with a particular group, then they were able to, and they felt comfortable having those conversations. And, for me, that makes somebody feel more comfortable in their job. They're less likely to leave their job. I'd like to think I was a very, very open manager, and I had some very, very deep, difficult conversations with lots of staff. But it was good that they were able to open up, and certainly the one that we mentioned earlier, that was a very, very sensitive conversation. But the fact he felt comfortable to be able to do that, and we had the support groups in place at Fujitsu, made a real difference. If you're managing people, you don't always know what's going on, and people, as Martin mentioned, don't always disclose conditions when they come in, and they might not feel comfortable. Things like neurodiversity, we touched on that in one of the other episodes, but people will maybe not disclose because they don't feel comfortable. But once they're in, and there are reasonable adjustments for people to make, or support networks for them to feel more included.
I think it's actually an actively attractive thing for an organisation to have these networks that people can say, I want to join that company. They've got, plenty of support available for people. So it's definitely something to be shouting about and advertising as a manager.
Yeah, and with Fujitsu, I worked there for 21 years, and then I moved on to work for a local authority for 3 years, and then coming back to Fujitsu. But then coming back as a new starter after 3 years away, and going through all the new starter process, and the amount of emails, wanting to make you feel included, and being able to be completely you and who you are. And that's actually, it was quite refreshing, because 21 years ago we didn't have that. So to see what the new starter process was then for somebody coming in, and how much it was certainly promoting inclusiveness, was really positive to see.
Smaller organisations may not have this as well. Beth, have you got anything to add here with your experience with organisations in having these sorts of networks?
They can be really powerful, but it really depends on what's happening outside of the groups, and whether they're being set up with the intention of creating a space for people to go and get together and sort of discuss things. But the organisation has to be ready to listen and take action. And so I've seen that work really well, but I've also seen spaces where, people just feel like, well, we've got a group which is great for us in terms of having a community, feeling that we've got a safe space, feeling like we've got commonality with others, and, to take things that we're struggling with, we're observing, take ideas, with a real desire to make things better. But if the organisation is doing it in that tokenistic way and isn't willing to listen and take action, then it's just going to make people feel more angry, I think, is probably the outcome that
the lip service
of that. So I've kind of seen examples of both ends, really, and I think it's so important these are not tokenistic spaces. It's important to create safe spaces for people, but it's equally important to be ready to do the work and to support people to put their ideas into action.
I guess that's crystallised a thought for me that although we've been talking about allies in people, that there's also a role as an organisation, as an entity about being an ally, because as you say, it's really important that things like these networks don't turn into talking shops or maybe groups where people moan about the injustice that they're currently experiencing within an organisation. And as you say, that there is no conduit to do something about it. So if an organisation is going to commit to inclusion, then it's really important that it has to learn from its employees, and this is a perfect route through which you can learn and then take action.
I've got an example as well where it's actually even beyond that organisational scope. So in the skateboarding community, there's an initiative called Pushing Against Racism, and they've kind of come up with this commitment to anti-racism in skateboarding. And all of the language around it, all of the website, all the information there is really strongly, so it's for kind of skateboarders, skate shops, people who kind of identify as being in that community, that signing the commitment is not enough, that there's principles and actions that they want people to put into action, take away with them. There's lesson plans to sort of work with young people and children to support them. They present a anti-oppression vocabulary takeaway that people can kind of, so some of those resources we were talking about earlier that people feel they don't know where to look and they don't know what to do. I think that's a really clear example for me of wanting to be allies, but actually not being constrained by anything other than like people who are in the skate community, and that's global, right? So I think it's really interesting to think about allyship as a movement, as well as that individual and organisational level.
I think that's lovely. And like you say, it's coming from the grassroots there, it's coming from within the group. How can we start making these steps to put being an ally into practice?
From a people manager perspective, I just think it's enabling people within the team. And, I've always tried to enable them to be active and to engage and to be part of these programs. And I think it really absolutely has to drive from the top. Allies of mine, I would class Martin as a former ally of mine, but also the other people within different CSR communities. A chap called Craig Hall we used to work with, he was certainly a big ally within the CSR community. But yeah, for me, enabling my team, and that's how I tend to recruit those allies.
Beth, how would you say about starting putting things into action, maybe one of your role models?
It's really going back to what I was saying earlier about listening to the people around you. And I think it's Brené Brown where I've got this from, but apparently the root of the word courage, and I think that's come up quite a bit, that it kind of takes courage to be in that ally space. But the root of that word is about speaking one's mind by telling all of one's heart. So it's really finding that connection, whether it's to another human being or a community, or it could even be connecting with your heart to a sense of justice, or really listening to your gut. Like if you feel like something's wrong or that you're noticing something and you're not quite sure, I think a tactic that I use sometimes is just naivety. So I'll just sort of say, oh, I'm really sorry. Could you just say that again? Or could you just explain what you meant by that? I've been in situations where that has been quite pointed because someone said something that I've perceived as a bit of microaggression, or they've said something really overtly about another colleague or person who's there. So just, I'm sorry, could you just explain that again? What did you mean by that? Can actually just confront the person in a really non-confrontational way, and it allows space for the person to describe their intention. It also provides space for other people to come in and maybe share how it's made them feel or how they interpreted things. So I think it's that listening piece, but also listening to your gut, listening to your heart, really trying to connect in with what other people's experience might be, and being that voice. Martin spoke about that before, and Mark, you talked about empowerment. It's being that voice where maybe others don't feel able, or at that time don't feel able to step into that space. When
you say about sort of naively asking somebody to explain what they meant as well, I think that's a really good way of diffusing potential bias. And I always like to think that people are trying to do and say the right thing, and sometimes they don't know what that looks like. But of course, we have to be responsible for both the intent and the impact of what we say and do. And if we create a mess, we have to be responsible for and do something about the fallout from it. And I guess that segues quite nicely into a really important thing that I think is a value for an ally, which is about listening to other people's lived experiences. Because with the best will in the world, you cannot understand what it feels like for somebody else who is different from you, and that's the way we learn. And there's plenty of evidence to show that hearing a lived experience is much more valuable than things like reports and stats and analysis, because it plays to the emotional part of the brain, and people are more likely to engage in it. I think the other things that I would share for being an ally at the personal level as well would be not feeling that you have to know everything and that you have to know all the answers. It's really about being prepared to engage and to support somebody, and maybe to help them by signposting or to work with them on finding the answers to things. And there's a bit about authenticity and your own credibility. So if you're going to do something, if you're going to say you're going to do something, then deliver on your promises and walk the walk. And sometimes it's just the small things that you can do as well that can make a difference. You asked about role models as well. I have two that I'd like to contribute. So I'm afraid they both fit into the gay arena a little bit. The first one is the singer Hazel Dean. She was a pop star from the 80s primarily. And the reason why I want to cite her is because she is extremely active on Twitter, maybe on other social platforms as well, about the ongoing debate that there is for trans and non-binary people in the UK and how they're being vilified. And she is a staunch trans supporter, and she is using her platform for those people. And she doesn't need to do that, but she is choosing to do it. The other one from the 1980s, I guess, was Diana, Princess of Wales, because when she walked into that first HIV ward and shook hands with a patient who'd got AIDS, that was an incredibly powerful message that went around the world. And again, she didn't need to do that, but she did that as an ally.
I think this comes back to the start, superheroes. This is allies as superheroes.
When I was thinking about this, like who's a good role model, the thing that I kept coming back to was, so I love music. I go to lots of gigs and really like being in that space. But often, and particularly when I was younger, I used to listen to a lot of heavier sort of punk, hardcore music. And often I was very in the very minority female group of fans in the audience. And the example that really strongly came up for me was a guy called Sam Carter, who's the lead singer of a band called The Architects. And they're like a metalcore, so it's like a mixture of heavy metal and hardcore punk, so really hard music. He stopped a show, I think it was in about 2016 2017 in the Netherlands, because there was a woman crowd surfing and he saw someone grope her as she went past, and he just stopped the set and kind of said, there's no place for that here. So it's not just about the fact that he stopped and kind of checked in with this woman, but he was like called out that this does not belong at my show. There's no place for that in this community. And that for me is such a powerful use of your voice, to be on a stage, probably, childhood dream, to be up there playing to fans and people who are really into your music. I'm sure that must be such a euphoric feeling, but to override all of that, to notice an injustice and notice a sexual assault and to kind of stop what was happening and to care about the safety of the people who are there, I guess, in service of seeing you. For me, it's such an accessible example because it shows how simple it is to make that choice in the moment, to just say, no, I'm not having this. I'm sure it was filled with much more expletives than the way I'm conveying it at the moment, but to just stop.
I can imagine.
Absolutely not happening. I think that for me was what I kept circling back to. That feels really powerful.
Yeah, that's a lovely example, and it's not one you'd necessarily expect. So that's a lovely example.
The fighter Paddy Pamlet delivered a very, very powerful mental health message about men.
Yes.
Men talking, and it's had so much traction around different social media, media in general, and somebody like that in the public eye, again, not something that I had to do, but I obviously felt quite passionate about that and delivered a very, very powerful message. And I'd never heard of this guy before, but I remember who he is now because of that message that he delivered. So I think that was a great example.
And we all have platforms. We can all, bring our voice and bring our values to bear. What's your number one tip for being a good ally to others?
So I would say we've got 2 ears and 1 mouth, and that we should use them in that ratio. So really listening to lived experiences is enlightening, and it's a great opportunity to learn about other people, and that gives you a little bit of an insight before you then make a decision and start to take action.
Mark, how about you? What's your top tip?
Sometimes sharing your own lived experiences, and if somebody's having a mental health breakdown, and that's something that you've gone through, those real experiences, because you can understand a little bit about how they're feeling and be incredibly empathetic. But yeah, certainly sitting down, listening, but then wanting to do something and wanting to take action and wanting to help.
I think that's a very valuable point there about sharing lived experiences. There's a question about, is it appropriate? I think it always is, as long as it's not making it about you. And Beth?
I suppose a different piece of advice maybe from me would be that curiosity piece. So ask people, and if you're worried about saying the wrong thing, you can call that out. You can say, I'm worried I might say this wrong, but my intention is this. And I think,
yes,
asking people, could you help me understand your context? Could you tell me about your life? Could I learn about your community? Could I come with you to do something that's meaningful to you and your family and your community? Or, it's really that piece of asking people, being interested, being curious, and then listening. So then going into there's 2 ears and 1 mouth. So be in the space as a listener.
We're listening, we're sharing, and then we're sort of traveling alongside. So lovely. Thank you very much, Beth.
Thank you.
And thank you, Mark.
Thank you for having me.
And here's this episode's self-care tip.
White Skies Self-Care.
Mindfulness is good, right? But if you're like many of my clients, being able to find time to quietly meditate doesn't feel possible at first. This tip is about how to incorporate mindfulness through doing in your day. I found eating works well, as we typically have plenty of opportunities to try. I'm using the example of the ginger nut biscuit or 2 I ate this morning during my coffee break. But you could select a piece of fruit, a sandwich, a chocolate, or anything really. First off, you'll need to find a time when you won't be disturbed by telephone calls or other people for just a few minutes. You may have to put some thought into finding this. Sit comfortably in your chair and take a few deep breaths. Next, we're going to work through what we see, feel, smell, taste, and hear. I pick up my biscuit. It's round, light orangey brown, and it's darker around the edges. It's neither hot nor cold, and it's dry and slightly rough. When my mind starts to wander, I just bring it back to my breath and then back to my biscuit. Next, I bring the food up to my nose and breathe in the aroma. Biscuity, with a hint of ginger, and my mouth starts to water. I consider the journey my biscuit has taken. Flour from wheat in the field, ginger and sugar from further afield, and a noisy factory where it was produced. Now bringing the food to my mouth, I touch it to my lips, teeth and tongue and consider what this feels like. Next, I take a small bite and begin to slowly chew, for longer than I usually would. What does my chewing sound like? I notice the texture and taste sensations and how these change as I chew and eventually swallow. I consider the lingering sensations, the gingery taste and the gentle heat, and then my expectations for my next mouthful. And then I repeat until my biscuit and my break are over. So this was mindfulness, a mindful break, pleasantly squeezed into my busy day. You can use this technique for a snack, a meal, and even adapt it to the process of cooking. See if you can get a mindful moment or 2 into your day.
White Skies Self-Care.
Thanks for listening to Wide Skies. We really hope you've enjoyed it. And a big thanks to our guests, Beth McManus and Mark Overend.
And we look forward to catching up with you on our other episodes. And here's a quick reminder about how you can get in touch and how you can access a captioned version of the podcast.
Contact us at linktree/Wide Skies, where you can also find a link to the captioned version of this podcast.
And it's goodbye from me until next time.
And it's goodbye from me.
Guy reads 2-2. I'm a safe onward flight.
Well-being. inclusion, diversity, equality. Wide Skies, a podcast produced and edited by Majoya Consulting in collaboration with Bridgeborn Psychology.